They called her weak. They called her ruined. They thought a divorced woman alone in the West would freeze, starve, and disappear. But Abby Preston carried something more dangerous than money. Intelligence, courage, and a heart that refused to surrender.
One bag. That was it. That was the sum total of 42 years on this earth. Abby Preston stood on the train platform, the leather handle of her valise biting into her palm. The morning air was thick, heavy with coal smoke, heavy with endings. She didn't cry. The tears were long gone, cried out in the dark, empty rooms of a house that wasn't hers anymore. Harrison Vance was a banker, a man who understood numbers, not people. When he decided he wanted a younger, shinier wife, he didn't just ask for a divorce. He orchestrated a slaughter. He used the courts. He used the law. He stripped Abby of everything: the savings, the silver, the dignity. But the worst part? The part that sat like a stone in her chest? Lydia, her daughter, 19 years old. Harrison had looked at their girl and offered her a choice: the inheritance, the dresses, the society balls, or a mother with nothing to her name. Lydia chose the money. Abby didn't hate her for it. Survival makes cowards of us all. But it broke her, truly, deeply broke her. Harrison's final act of mercy was a joke, a legal maneuver to keep him looking like a gentleman. He deeded Abby a plot of land, 250 acres, out west, in Colorado, a place called Dry Gulch, a patch of dirt so worthless it wasn't even on the main map. He sent her there to fail, to fade away. The train whistle blew, a sharp, lonely sound. Abby picked up her bag. She stepped onto the train. She didn't look back. The rhythm of the rails was hypnotic. Clack, 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 clack. Days blurred. The lush green of the east turned into the endless pale yellow of the plains. Then came the mountains, looming, unforgiving. Abby sat by the window, her spine straight, her dress neatly pressed, though the edges were starting to fray. She wasn't alone in the car. Across the aisle, sitting in the corner shadow, was a man. He'd been there since St. Louis. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in canvas and worn denim. A Stetson hat pulled low over his eyes. He didn't move much. He just sat, watching the world roll by. But his hands, tanned, scarred, resting on his knees, were the hands of a man who worked the earth, who knew how to build things, or break them. Once, their eyes met. His were a piercing, quiet gray. He tipped his hat, just a fraction, a silent acknowledgement. He didn't try to make small talk. Out here, folks respected the quiet. His name was Elias Thorne. Not that Abby knew it yet. Dry Gulch. The train squealed to a halt, kicking up a cloud of red dust. Abby coughed, stepping down onto the wooden platform. It wasn't really a station, just a shack, a water tower, and a sign swinging on a rusty nail. The wind hit her instantly. It was hot, dry. It smelled like sagebrush and empty promises. The station master came ambling out of the shack. A stout, greasy-haired man with a smirk permanently etched into his face. He wiped his hands on a dirty apron and looked Abby, up and down. His eyes lingered on her plain dress, on her single bag. "You must be the Preston woman," he drawled. His voice was loud. Too loud. "Got a telegram from your ex-husband's lawyer last week. Said to expect a divorced city woman coming to play homesteader." Abby's jaw tightened. She kept her chin up. "I am Abigail Preston. Can you point me toward my property?" The man let out a harsh bark of laughter. "Property? Lady, you own a dust bowl. No water. No shade. Hell, not even a rattlesnake wants to live on that plot." He leaned in, his breath smelling of stale whiskey. "A woman like you cast aside, no husband, no money ain't gonna last a week. Why don't you just get back on the train? Save us the trouble of burying you." Abby felt the heat rise in her cheeks. The shame, the exhaustion. For a second, the heavy bag in her hand felt like it might pull her straight down into the dirt. Then a boot hit the wooden planks. A heavy, solid thud. Elias Thorne stepped down from the train car. He walked up behind Abby. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He just stood there, a wall of quiet strength. He looked at the station master. The gray eyes were cold now, like winter ice. "Mr. Elias said, his voice deep and entirely calm. "You're going to apologize to this lady, right now." The station master scoffed, though he took a half step back. "Listen here, cowboy, I just call it like I see it. She asked a divorced woman with nothing, no standing, no value. What's it to you?" Elias didn't flinch. He spoke clearly, loud enough for the men loading cargo nearby to hear every single word. "You listen to me, and you listen well," Elias said. "A divorce decree, or a dry patch of dirt, doesn't determine a person's worth. Human dignity isn't measured by a bank account or a husband's name. It is found in the courage to stand up and start over. Every person, man or woman, deserves equal respect when they are trying to rebuild their life. And that is a right she possesses simply by drawing breath. That is something every man here ought to respect." The station went dead silent. The wind just howled. The station master swallowed hard. The smirk vanished. I meant no offense, ma'am. Property's 2 miles east. Follow the wagon ruts." He turned and scurried back into his shack. Abby let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She turned to Elias. "You didn't have to do that, but thank you." Elias tipped his hat. "S is Thorne, ma'am, and I did have to. Truth's truth. Mind if I walk with you? My ranch borders your land." "Abigail Preston," she said, "and I would appreciate the company, Mr. Thorne." They walked the 2 miles in silence. The land was brutal, beautiful, in a harsh way, but brutal. The earth was cracked. The grass was pale and brittle. When they finally reached the boundary line, Abby saw it. Stuck dead in the center of the cracked earth was a fresh wooden stake. Pinned to it was a piece of parchment sealed in wax. Abby walked over to it. The handwriting was Harrison's crisp, arrogant script. Property of Harrison Vance, to revert back to original owner upon failure of occupant within 1 year. It was a trap. He wanted her to look at this land, look at this sign, and break. He wanted her to crawl back, begging for scraps. Abby stared at the paper. Then she reached out. Her hands were soft, city hands, but she gripped the rough wood of the stake. She pulled. It held fast. She gritted her teeth, planted her boots in the dust, and pulled harder. Splinters bit into her palms. With a sharp crack, the stake gave way. She tossed Harrison's note into the wind. She turned the wooden stake upside down, driving the flat end into the dirt so it stood blank and bare. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a piece of charcoal, and wrote in bold, dark letters, "Claimed. A. Preston." She dusted her hands off. She stood tall, feeling the Colorado wind whip through her hair. Behind her, Elias Thorne leaned against a fence post. He looked at the cracked earth. Then he looked at her. And for the first time since St. Louis, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. It wasn't much of a smile, but it was a start. The sun dropped behind the Rockies, fast, like a stone in a pond, and with the dark came the cold. Out east, the night settled in gently. Here, it hit you. It sank right through the cotton of Abby's dress. It settled deep into her bones. She surveyed her empire. 250 acres of nothing. The wind pushed across the plains, whistling through the dry sagebrush. There was no house, no cabin, not even a lean-to, just an old, rotting wagon box left behind by some pioneer who had given up the ghost years ago. It would have to do. Abby took her single leather bag. She climbed into the wagon box. The wood was splintered. It smelled of old dust and dry rot. She pulled her knees to her chest. She wrapped her coat tight around her shoulders. She didn't sleep. You don't sleep the first night you lose your whole world. You just wait for the sun. Morning broke, pale and sharp. Abby climbed out of the wagon. Her back ached. Her lips were cracked from the wind. But she stood up straight. She brushed the dirt from her skirt. Then she smelled it. Coffee. She turned. About 50 yards away, a small campfire crackled. A black iron pot sat on the coals. Beside it stood Elias Thorne. He was holding 2 tin cups. He didn't wave. He didn't shout. He just poured the coffee. Abby walked over. The heat of the fire was a blessing. Black, Elias said. He handed her a cup. Out of sugar, out of milk, out of most things that make life soft. Black is fine, Abby said. Her voice was raspy. She took a sip. It was strong enough to float a horseshoe. It was perfect. They stood in silence for a minute, watching the sun paint the dry earth a pale shade of gold. You made it through the night, Elias said. Most folks from the city would have started walking back to the tracks by midnight. I have nowhere to walk back to, Mr. Thorne. Elias looked at her, really looked at her, over the rim of his cup. Elias, out here. Titles just get in the way. Elias, then. I'm Abby. He nodded. He set his cup down on a flat rock. He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, battered leather book. I have a problem, Abby, Elias said. He flipped the book open. The pages were a mess of crossed-out numbers, smudged ink, and chaotic scribbles. I run 400 head of cattle. I got fences to mend, horses to break, men to pay. But I can't make heads or tails of a ledger. Every time I go to town, the bank tells me I'm short. I know I'm not, but I can't prove it. He looked up. I need a bookkeeper, someone who understands numbers, someone who won't lie to me, someone who won't let the bank lie to me. He gestured to the vast, empty land around them. You need a roof. You need water. You need a way to make it past winter. Abby looked at the ledger. She had taught herself accounting years ago, secretly, just to figure out where Harrison was hiding his money. She was good at it. Very good. You want to make a trade, she said. I do. You fix my books. You keep the town from robbing me blind. In return, I bring my tools. I help you build. I help you dig a well. We keep you alive. It was a fair deal. More than fair. But Abby had lived for 20 years, under a man who gave her things just to own her. She wasn't going to step into another cage, even if the bars were made of kindness. She set her coffee down. She looked Elias square in the eye. If we do this, Elias, we need to be clear about something right now, Abby said. Her voice was firm, unshaking. This help cannot become pity, and it cannot become control. I have spent my entire adult life as a subordinate in my own home. I will not do it again. Elias stayed perfectly still, listening. Equality between a man and a woman isn't a gift a man bestows, Abby stated, pronouncing every word with deliberate weight. It is a fundamental human right. No matter how much physical labor you do here, no matter how big a house you build, I must have an equal voice in every single decision regarding this land. We work as partners, or we don't work at all. The wind gusted, kicking up a swirl of red dust between them. Elias didn't blink. He didn't look offended. In fact, the respect in his gray eyes deepened. Partner it is, Elias said. He held out his hand, rough, calloused, large. Abby took it. Her grip was strong. They shook. No contracts, no lawyers. Out west, a handshake in the dirt meant more than a seal in a courthouse. Good, Elias said. He turned and walked to his horse. He pulled down a bundle of wooden stakes and a heavy roll of twine. He grabbed a sledgehammer. He walked to the center of Abby's land. The flattest part, he drove a stake into the ground. Whack! He pulled out the twine. He started walking. He took long, measured strides. 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, 40 feet. He stopped. He drove another stake. Whack! Abby frowned. She walked over to him. Elias, what are you doing? Laying the foundation, he said. He turned 90 degrees. He started walking again. Need to know where to dig the footings. But, Elias, that's 40 feet across, and you're still walking. She looked at the massive square he was outlining in the dirt. I only need a cabin. Just a single room. A stove and a bed. Something to keep the rain off. Elias stopped. He let the sledgehammer rest on the dry earth. He took off his hat and wiped his brow with his sleeve. He looked back east, toward the horizon. Toward the world Abby had left behind. Harrison Vance sent you out here to die in a shack, Elias said softly. He wanted you to freeze in a little box, to feel small, to feel worthless. He put his hat back on. He looked at her. We aren't going to let that happen, Elias said. The rhythm of his voice was like a drumbeat, steady, certain. I am going to build a mansion on this very dirt. A real home. Wide porches, high ceilings, deep roots, so that every time that man looks west, he'll know he threw away a queen, and he'll know you built an empire without him. Abby stood frozen. The wind whipped her skirt. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked at her and seen a queen. They had only ever seen a wife, a mother, a discarded thing. She looked at the huge footprint marked in the dust. A mansion. Here, in the middle of nowhere. She swallowed the lump in her throat. She stepped up to the twine. Then we'd better get to digging, Abby said. The dirt did not care that Abby was from the city. The dirt did not care that she used to wear silk. It fought her for every inch. Day 3. The sun was a hammer. Abby swung the pickaxe. The iron head struck the baked earth. Thwack! A jar of pain shot up her arms, settling right in her shoulders. She pulled the pick free. She swung again. Thwack! Her hands were covered in blisters. 3 of them had already popped. The raw skin stung like fire. She didn't stop. Elias was 10 yards away, using a post-hole digger to sink the deep foundation pillars. He was shirtless, his back slick with sweat, muscles pulling taut with every movement. He worked with a steady, relentless rhythm. He never complained. He never slowed down. A rumble of wooden wheels broke the silence of the plains. Abby paused, leaning on her pickaxe. A heavy freight wagon was cresting the low ridge. It was pulled by 2 sturdy draft horses. The wagon bed was loaded high with raw pine lumber, barrels of nails, and a heavy cast-iron stove. Driving the wagon was a man with deep, weathered, copper skin. His dark hair was braided neatly down his back. Beside him sat a woman with a kind face, wearing a simple calico dress. Elias dropped his digger. He wiped his face with a rag and walked over to greet them. Abby followed. Arthur. Martha, Elias said, a genuine smile breaking across his stoic face. He reached up and shook the man's hand. Elias, Arthur said. His voice was deep, resonant. We brought the lumber from the high ridge. Just like you asked. Much obliged, Elias said. He turned to Abby. Abby, these are my friends, and my best ranch hands, Arthur and Martha. Abby stepped forward. She wiped her dirty, blistered hand on her skirt before offering it. It is an honor to meet you both. I'm Abigail Preston. Martha smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. She took Abby's hand. She felt the popped blisters. She looked down at the dirt, then up at Abby. You swing the pickaxe yourself? It's my house, Abby said simply. I intend to know what the dirt beneath it feels like. Arthur chuckled, a low, warm sound. Good. A house built on someone else's sweat never feels like home. They got to work. Arthur and Elias began offloading the heavy timbers. Martha started organizing the tools and setting up a proper camp kitchen. Abby didn't sit down. She went right back to the pickaxe. When the foundation holes were deep enough, she helped Martha mix the heavy clay and water to pack the footings. It was grueling. It was filthy. It was the best Abby had felt in 20 years. By the end of the week, the floor joists were down. The skeleton of the mansion was starting to rise from the dust. It was huge. 4 large rooms, a sweeping front porch. Elias and Arthur were up on the frame, trying to set the first roof trusses. The wind was kicking up, making the heavy wood dangerous to handle. "It's not sitting right, Elias," Arthur called out over the wind. He was holding a large framing square, looking at the peak. "The cut is off. If we pitch it like this, the winter snow is going to pool on the west side. It'll cave the roof in by January." Elias frowned, wiping sweat from his eyes. "I measured it twice. It should be a standard 6/12 pitch." "The wood is warped," Arthur said. "We have to recalculate the angle. But I don't know the math for a skewed joist." Elias sighed in frustration. "Neither do I. We're going to have to guess and shim it." "You don't have to guess." Elias and Arthur looked down. Abby was standing on the floorboards. She was holding a piece of charcoal and a flat scrap of pine. "Toss me your tape measure," Abby said. Elias looked surprised, but he dropped the canvas measuring tape down to her. Abby caught it. She measured the width of the floor span. She looked at the height of the center post. Elias had erected. Then she sat down on a barrel. For a moment, she closed her eyes. She pictured her father, Thomas Waverly, the federal land surveyor. She remembered the long, dusty summers she spent with him as a girl. Before Harrison Vance told her, ladies didn't do math, before the world told her to sit down and be quiet. Her hand moved. The charcoal scratched across the pine board. Triangles, angles. The Pythagorean theorem applied to rough-cut lumber. "Cut the west truss at 34 degrees, Abby called up to them. "Cut the east truss at 36. It'll compensate for the warp in the ridge beam and give you a perfect runoff slope." Arthur looked at Elias. Elias looked at the piece of wood in his hand. "You sure about that, Abby?" Elias asked. "I've never been sure of anything in my life," she said. She smiled, a real bright smile. Arthur climbed down, made the cuts with his handsaw, and hauled the timber back up. They slotted the pieces together. Clack. Perfect fit. Tight as a drum. Arthur laughed out loud. "Elias, my friend, you found yourself a wizard." Elias looked down at her. The pride in his eyes was unmistakable. "Looks like I did." The peace of the afternoon was shattered an hour later. Another wagon rolled up the rutted trail. This one was fancy. Painted wheels. A matched pair of gray geldings pulling it. Driving the wagon was Jebediah Smith. He ran the mercantile in Dry Gulch. He was a small man with a tight, pinched face, a man who liked to know everyone's business. Jeb pulled the horses to a halt. He looked at the massive frame of the house. He looked at Abby, covered in dust. Then he looked at Arthur and Martha, who were eating lunch by the fire. Jeb spat a stream of chewing tobacco into the dirt. "Afternoon, Elias," Jeb called out. "See you're building a palace out here for the city lady." "Afternoon, Jeb," Elias said. He didn't smile. He climbed down from the framing. He walked over to the wagon. "Came to drop off the nails you ordered," Jeb said. He tossed a heavy burlap sack onto the ground. It landed with a metallic clatter. Then Jeb leaned over the wagon rail. He lowered his voice, but not enough. "Tell me something, Elias. Word in town is you're paying those Indians the same daily wage you pay white carpenters." Elias stopped wiping his hands on his rag. He went completely still. Abby put her charcoal down. She walked over, standing right beside Elias. Arthur and Martha kept their eyes on their food, but their shoulders tensed. They had heard this 100 times before. "The word in town is correct," Elias said. His voice was flat, dangerous. Jeb scoffed. "You're a fool, Thorne. You're ruining the local economy. You pay them half. That's the way it is. They're lucky to even have the work. Ain't natural, treating them like they're the same as us." Elias took one step forward. He looked Jeb directly in the eyes. "Jebediah," Elias said. His voice echoed across the quiet plains. Loud, clear. "You listen to me. Compassion and fairness don't have a skin color. Arthur and Martha work harder than any man in your town. They bleed red, they sweat salt, and their labor builds the very walls that keep the wind off our backs." Jeb blinked, gripping his reins tighter. "Honest labor demands an honest wage," Elias continued, explicitly laying down the law of his land. "Paying folks fairly is a basic human right, not a privilege we hand out based on where a man was born or what he looks like. If you have a problem with equality, you can take your nails, put them back in your wagon, and never set foot on this property again." Silence fell over the plains. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Abby looked at Elias. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Not out of fear, out of profound respect. This wasn't just a cowboy. This was a man of absolute moral iron. Jeb looked at Elias's cold gray eyes. He looked at Abby's defiant stance. He swallowed hard. "Leave the nails," Jeb muttered. "Just leave 'em. Bank your account." Jeb snapped the reins. The wagon turned in a wide arc and hurried back toward town. Elias watched the dust settle. Then he turned around. He looked at Arthur and Martha. "Break time is over," he said softly. "We have a roof to finish." Arthur smiled. He stood up, grabbing his hammer. "Yes, boss." Abby walked back to her barrel. She picked up her charcoal. Her hands were bruised, her back was aching, and her life was still in pieces. But as she looked at the bones of the mansion rising against the Colorado sky, she knew one thing for certain. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Dry Gulch was not a town built for comfort. It was built for survival. A single dirt road cut through a huddle of false front wooden buildings. A bank, a saloon, a mercantile, a sheriff's office. The wind blew through the street like a restless ghost, kicking up red dust that coated the windows and tasted like copper on the tongue. Abby drove the wagon into town on a Tuesday morning. The sun was already hot. 3 weeks had passed since Elias drove that first stake into the ground. The bones of the mansion were up. The floors were laid, but they needed the cedar shingles for the roof. Winter didn't wait for anyone in Colorado. You either had a roof by the first freeze, or you didn't see the spring. Elias had paid for the lumber a month ago. It was supposed to be at the rail depot today. Abby pulled the team of draft horses up to the depot. She tied the reins to the hitching post. She smoothed her skirt. It was faded, patched at the hem, but clean. She held her head high. She walked into the depot office. The clerk behind the counter was a young man, barely 20. When he saw Abby, his face flushed. He suddenly found the paperwork on his desk fascinating. "Excuse me," Abby said. Her voice was polite, even. "I am here for the Thorne lumber order. 5 crates of cedar shingles." The boy didn't look up. "Ain't here, ma'am." "It was scheduled for the morning freight," Abby pressed. "Did the train not come?" "Train came." The boy swallowed hard. He finally looked up, his eyes darting to the door. "Wood ain't here. Order got canceled." Or diverted. "I just handle the manifests, lady. You want to talk to somebody, you talk to the land agent." Abby felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She left the depot. She walked down the boardwalk toward the mercantile. She needed flour, coffee, and nails. As she walked, she felt the eyes. A group of women in stiff, high-collared dresses stood outside the dressmaker's shop. When Abby approached, their conversation died, abruptly. One of the women, the banker's wife, by the look of her velvet trim, turned her back. The others followed suit, a solid wall of broadcloth and disdain. Abby kept walking. She didn't speed up. She didn't look down. She stepped into the mercantile. Jebediah Smith was behind the counter, weighing a sack of beans. He looked up, saw Abby, and his mouth thinned into a hard line. "Morning, Mr. Smith," Abby said. She placed a list on the counter. "I need 50 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of coffee, and a keg of roofing nails." Jebediah didn't touch the list. He kept his hands on the brass scales. "Sorry, Mrs. Preston," Jebediah said. He didn't sound sorry. "Fresh out of flour. Coffee spoken for. And I ain't got a single roofing nail left in the back." Abby looked past him. There were 3 sacks of flour sitting right on the floor behind the counter. A fresh wooden crate of nails was pried open next to them. "I see," Abby said softly. "Are you refusing my money, Mr. Smith? Or has someone paid you more to refuse it?" Jebediah's face turned a dull shade of red. "I reserve the right to serve who I please, and folks around here don't take kindly to city women coming out, acting high and mighty, living in the dirt with, well, with the kind of company you keep." He meant Elias. He meant Arthur and Martha. Harrison Vance's reach was long, but he couldn't control a whole town from Kansas. He needed a proxy. He needed someone here to pour the poison. "Good day, Mr. Smith," Abby said. She didn't argue. You don't argue with a puppet. You find the man pulling the strings. She stepped back out into the glare of the street. "Mrs. Preston, a moment, if you please." The voice was smooth, oiled, like a well-worn leather saddle. Abby turned. Standing on the boardwalk outside the local land office was a man in a tailored gray suit. Out here, a man in a suit without dust on his boots was a man who made his living off other people's sweat. He held a silver pocket watch in one hand, snapping it shut with a sharp click. "I am Silas Cobb," he said, offering a practiced hollow smile. "I represent the Regional Land Authority, and, occasionally, certain private banking interests back east." Harrison. Abby stood her ground. "Mr. Cobb, I was just told my lumber was diverted, and my town credit seems to have evaporated. I assume I have you to thank." Cobb chuckled. It was a dry, rattling sound. He stepped closer, stepping into her shade. "Now, Mrs. Preston, let us not be hostile. I am merely a man of business, and business requires stability." Cobb steepled his fingers. "Your presence here, it upsets the natural order of things. A divorced woman, alone, building a monstrosity of a house on a barren plot of land. It's unnatural. It makes the townspeople nervous." "I am building a home on land that I own," Abby said. Her voice was like cracking ice. "There is nothing unnatural about a property owner improving her plot." Cobb sighed, a heavy, patronizing sigh. "The land was a gesture, a formality. You were meant to sell it back, or let it default. Your ex-husband is a very powerful man, Mrs. Preston. He is willing to offer you a modest cash settlement, a train ticket back to Boston, a quiet life. All you have to do is sign the deed over to me today. No, just one word. Flat. Final." Cobb's smile vanished. The smooth veneer cracked, revealing the cold, calculating snake underneath. "You are making a mistake," Cobb said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You think you are safe because Elias Thorne is playing the gallant cowboy? Let me tell you something about men, Mrs. Preston. No man works for free." Abby didn't blink. "Elias and I have an arrangement." "An arrangement?" Cobb laughed cruelly. "Has he told you about the water? About the aquifers running under this valley? Thorne's ranch is expanding. He needs water. He looks at your land, and he doesn't see a woman in need. He sees a desperate, naive city lady sitting on resources he wants. He's using you, Mrs. Preston. When the house is built, he'll find a way to take the land. He is no better than the husband you left behind. The words hit her. A sharp, ugly strike. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. But Cobb knew how to plant a seed of doubt. He knew how to find the cracks in a person's foundation. "Keep your settlement, Mr. Cobb," Abby said. She stepped around him. "And keep out of my way." "The winter will freeze you out, Abigail," Cobb called after her, dropping the polite facade entirely. "You won't get a single plank of wood or a scrap of food in this county. You're a ghost out here." Abby walked away. Her hands were shaking. She forced them into fists. She needed to think. She needed the law. She crossed the dusty street and pushed open the heavy oak door of the Sheriff's office. It was cooler inside. It smelled of coffee, gun oil, and old paper. Behind a large, battered desk sat a man who looked like he was carved out of hickory wood. He had deep lines around his eyes, silver at his temples, and a silver star pinned to his canvas vest. Sheriff Jed Carter. He was reading a wanted poster. He looked up when Abby walked in. He didn't scowl. He didn't look away. He stood up, out of respect. "Mrs. Preston," the sheriff said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble. "I saw you talking to Silas Cobb out the window. Sit down. You look like you could use some coffee." He didn't ask. He just poured a cup from the stove and set it on the edge of his desk. Abby sat in the straight-backed wooden chair. She took a breath, letting the smell of the coffee ground her. "Sheriff Carter?" Abby said. "My lumber has been stolen, diverted by Silas Cobb. The mercantile is refusing to sell me food. The town is cutting me off. I am a legal property owner in this county, and I am being starved out on the orders of a man sitting in a bank in Kansas." Sheriff Carter sat heavily in his chair. He rubbed a hand over his face. He looked tired. Not just sleepy tired, soul tired. "I know," Carter said quietly. "You know?" Abby leaned forward. "If you know, why aren't you doing anything? Isn't it your job to stop extortion?" Carter looked at her. His eyes were sad, but completely honest. "Mrs. Preston, let me tell you how things work out here, past the rail lines. Silas Cobb didn't steal your wood. He bought the freight company's contract out from under Elias. It's dirty. It's ruthless. But on paper, it's entirely legal. He hasn't threatened you with violence. He's just using his wallet to build a wall around you." Abby felt a bitter taste in her mouth. "So the law protects the man with the money and leaves the woman alone in the dirt to freeze." Carter leaned forward. He rested his large hands on the desk. He didn't look away from her. "The law is too often bent to serve men with deep pockets, Mrs. Preston," Carter said. He spoke slowly, making sure she heard every syllable. "A law book is just paper. It doesn't have a conscience. True justice only exists when good people dare to speak up for the vulnerable. It requires people to stand firm when it's easier to walk away." He tapped his silver badge. "I cannot arrest a man for buying lumber. I cannot arrest a shopkeeper for refusing service. But hear me clearly, Mrs. Preston. Every person has an absolute right to exist, to build, and to be treated with equal dignity under the sky. What Cobb is doing is morally bankrupt, and if he or his men so much as set a boot on your property to intimidate you, or if they try to forge a single document to take your land, I will put them in irons myself." Abby looked at him. She saw the iron in his spine. He wasn't a corrupt man. He was a good man trapped in a rigged system. "You are not alone out here," Carter continued, his voice steady and resolute. "I will stand by your legal rights. I will ride out to your property twice a week to ensure your safety. Equality and protection aren't just words we leave back east. We have to build them here. From the dirt up, you stand your ground. I'll make sure nobody pushes you off it. Abby felt the tight knot in her chest loosen. Just a fraction, but enough to breathe. Thank you, Sheriff, Abby said softly. Don't thank me for doing what's right, Carter replied. Just get your roof built. The ride back to the property felt twice as long. The sun was dropping low, casting long, purple shadows across the plains. Abby guided the horses over the ruts, the empty wagon bed rattling behind her. She thought about Silas Cobb. She thought about his words. He's using you, Mrs. Preston. She shook her head. No. Elias Thorne was not Henry Harrison Vance. Built cages. Elias Thorne built foundations. But Cobb-S poison was designed to linger. It was designed to make her look at every act of kindness and wonder where the trap was. As she crested the final ridge, she saw it. The skeletal frame of the mansion against the sunset. It was beautiful, defiant. Elias was up on the roof joists. He was hammering temporary cross braces, securing the wood against the night winds. When he saw the wagon coming, empty, he stopped hammering. He climbed down. He walked out to meet her as she pulled the horses to a halt. He didn't ask where the wood was. He took one look at her face. He saw the exhaustion, the tight set of her jaw. He reached up and took the reins from her bruised hands. Who? Elias asked. Just one word, heavy as a falling tree. Silas Cobb, Abby said. Her voice was hoarse from the dust and the day. He works for Harrison. He bought the freight contract. He bought the town's silence. We aren't getting the lumber, and we aren't getting supplies from the mercantile. Elias looked toward the horizon. His jaw muscle ticked. Once, twice. He said something else, Abby added. She needed to say it. She needed to clear the air before the poison could take root. He said, you were only helping me because you want the water rights to my land. He said, you're using me. Elias slowly turned his head. He looked at her. The silence stretched between them. Only the wind made a sound, whistling through the empty window frames of the unfinished house. Elias didn't get angry. He didn't shout. He took a slow breath, his gray eyes locking onto hers. Do you believe him? Elias asked quietly. Abby looked at the calluses on Elias' hands. She looked at the massive frame of the house he had spent 3 weeks breaking his back to build for her. She thought about him standing down the station master on her first day. No, Abby said. I don't. Elias nodded. A fractional dip of his chin. Good, Elias said, because Cobb is a liar, and Harrison Vance is a fool. Elias turned and looked at the house. The roof was wide open to the sky. The winter was coming. We don't have shingles, Elias said, so we'll use sod. We'll cut the prairie grass, pack it tight with clay, and build a sod roof. It's heavy, it's ugly, but it'll keep you warm. And we don't need town credit to hunt deer or trap rabbit. He turned back to her. He offered his hand to help her down from the wagon. They want to starve us out, Abby, Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, fierce rumble. They want us to break. We aren't going to break, we're going to build. Abby took his hand. His grip was warm, solid. Yes, Abby said. We are. They walked back toward the house together, two people against the town, against the whole damn world. The mansion didn't have a roof yet, but the foundation was made of stone, and it wasn't going anywhere. The air tasted like pennies, dry, metallic, hot. 4 weeks had passed since Abby stepped off the train. The sod roof was up. It was heavy. It was thick with dirt and dried prairie grass, but it held. It kept the brutal sun off their backs. But out here, the sun wasn't the only enemy. The real enemy was the quiet. The slow, creeping kind. The kind that came when the rain didn't. Elias Ranch was hurting. You could hear it. It started as a low rumble, a restless shifting in the valley. 400 head of cattle pacing the dust. By noon on Tuesday, the rumble turned into a desperate, hollow bellowing. Abby stepped out onto the porch of the unfinished mansion. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. Arthur rode up on his dun gelding. The horse was lathered in white foam. Arthur pulled back hard on the reins. He didn't even bother to dismount. He just looked toward where Elias was chopping firewood. "Elias," Arthur called out. His deep voice carried a sharp edge of panic. "It's the North Creek. It's gone." Elias dropped the axe. The heavy blade buried itself in the chopping block. He walked over, his face grim. "Gone? You mean it's muddy?" "I mean it's baked rock," Arthur said, shaking his head. "The spring that feeds it must have dried up completely. The herd is bunching up at the dry bed. They re-thirsty, Elias. If they don't drink by tomorrow night, they'll start dropping. And if they smell water somewhere else, they'll stampede to get it." Elias took off his hat. He ran a hand through his dark hair. The lines around his eyes deepened. Silas Cobb's embargo on lumber and supplies was one thing. A man could fight another man. But you couldn't fight the sky. You couldn't punch a drought. "Saddle my horse," Elias said. His voice was tight. "We'll have to drive them east, toward the Red River." Arthur frowned. "That's a 3-day drive over hard rock. Half the calves won't make it. We lose 20% of the herd, maybe more. Better 30% than all of them," Elias said. He turned to head for the barn. "Wait." The word was sharp, clear. It cut right through the hot wind. Elias and Arthur turned. Abby stepped off the porch. She walked out into the yard, the dust swirling around her skirts. "Don't move the herd," Abby said. Elias looked at her. He was stressed. His livelihood was on the line. But he didn't snap at her. He kept his voice steady. "Abby, a cow needs 10 gallons of water a day. I have 400 of them. If I don't move them, they die." "I understand the math," Elias, Abby said. She walked past him, looking out toward the northern ridge. Her eyes were tracking the landscape. "But moving them is a death sentence for the calves. Let me see the land." Arthur looked at Elias. Elias looked at Abby. "See the land?" Elias asked. "Take me to the dry creek," Abby said. "Take me to the boundary line between your ranch and my property. Right now." Elias didn't argue. He didn't tell her this was Menace business. He just nodded. "Saddle up." They rode out together. Elias, Arthur, and Abby. The heat radiating off the prairie was visible. It rippled the horizon like a mirage. When they reached the North Creek, Abby saw the devastation. The creek bed was nothing but cracked, gray mud. Hundreds of cattle stood around it, sides heaving, flies buzzing around their dry eyes. The smell of dust and panicked animals was suffocating. Elias sat on his horse, his shoulders heavy. He was watching his life's work with her. Abby dismounted. She didn't look at the cows. She looked at the dirt. She looked at the slope of the valley. She walked down into the dry creek bed. She picked up a handful of the cracked clay. It crumbled into powder. She closed her eyes. She wasn't Abby, the discarded wife, right now. She was Abigail Waverly, daughter of Thomas Waverly, federal land surveyor. She remembered the heavy brass compass, the long chains, the topographical maps spread across the dining room table. She remembered her father's voice. "Water doesn't just vanish, Abby. It travels. It hides. You just have to know how to read the rock." She opened her eyes. She looked at the vegetation. "Look at the sagebrush." Abby pointed to the bank. "It's dead, gray and brittle." Elias nodded slowly. "Because there's no water. Now look over there." Abby pointed south. Toward her own property. Toward the 250 acres Harrison Vance had given her as a joke. Look at the saltbush. Look at the deep-rooted greasewood. What color is it? Elias squinted against the sun. Arthur stood up in his stirrups. It's green, Arthur said. His voice was hushed, dark green. Abby started walking. She walked fast, following the subtle dip of the land. Elias and Arthur guided their horses behind her. She walked past the boundary line. She walked right into the heart of her worthless, barren land. The land with no surface water, the Dust Bowl. She stopped in a wide, flat depression. It looked like nothing, just more dirt and rock. But to someone who knew how to read the earth, it was a neon sign. The creek didn't dry up, Abby said, turning to face them. Her eyes were bright, alive. The geological fault line shifted beneath the bedrock. It happens during dry spells. The clay layer cracked, and the surface water drained downward. Elias swung down from his saddle. Downward to where? Abby tapped the heel of her boot against the hard earth. Right here, Abby said. You're standing in a basin, a geographical bowl. Underneath this topsoil is a layer of hardpan clay. Underneath that clay is a gravel bed. The water from the northern ridge drained, hit the gravel, and pooled. Right here, beneath my feet. Arthur S.'s eyes went wide. An underground lake. An aquifer, Abby corrected. A massive one. Harrison Vance gave me this land because it looked dead on the surface. But he didn't know how to read a topographical map. He handed me the reservoir for the entire valley. Elias looked at the ground. Then he looked at Abby. How deep? 40 feet, Abby said. She calculated the slope of the basin in her head. Maybe 50. Not a shallow well, but it's there. I know it is. Elias didn't hesitate. He didn't ask if she was sure. He didn't demand proof. He looked at Arthur. Ride back to the barn. Get the heavy iron auger. Get the block and tackle. Get Martha and tell her to bring every empty barrel we own. Arthur grinned. A flash of white teeth against copper skin. He wheeled his horse around and took off at a dead gallop. Digging a deep bore, well by hand, is not work. It is war. They set up the heavy wooden tripod over the spot Abby had marked. They hung the iron auger, a massive, corkscrew-like drill bit from the block and tackle. Elias and Arthur manned the heavy wooden crossbar. They walked in a circle, pushing the bar, driving the iron bit into the earth. Grind, creak, bite. Abby worked the winch. When the bit was full of dirt, she pulled the heavy ropes, hoisting the iron out of the hole. She cleared the heavy clay with a shovel, hands blistering all over again. Then they dropped the bit back down. 10 feet, dry dirt. 20 feet, hardpan clay. The sun set. They lit lanterns. They kept pushing. Martha arrived with the wagon, loaded with barrels, food, and coffee. She took over the winch, giving Abby a brief respite. But Abby refused to sit down. She helped Elias push the crossbar, shoulder to shoulder, 30 feet. The clay turned to shale. It was brutal. Every rotation made Elias's muscles scream. His hands were bleeding. Arthur was panting, his shirt soaked through. We might have missed it, Arthur gasped, leaning against the crossbar. Maybe the fault line shifted further east. No, Abby said. Her voice was raw, exhausted, but absolute. The math is right. The earth doesn't lie. Push. Elias looked at her in the lantern light. He saw the fierce, unyielding fire in her eyes. He gripped the bloody wood of the crossbar. You heard the lady, Elias growled. Push. 40 feet crack. The iron auger hit something hard. Then it slipped. The crossbar jerked forward suddenly, sending Elias and Arthur stumbling. The sound came first, a low, hollow hiss, like a lung taking a deep breath. Then came the smell, cold, pure, wet stone and sweet minerals. Elias dropped to his knees. He peered over the edge of the dark, narrow shaft. A wet, gurgling sound echoed up the pipe. "Pull the auger," Elias yelled. Abby and Martha hauled on the winch ropes. The iron bit came up. It wasn't covered in dry dust. It was slathered in thick, dripping, dark mud, and right behind it came the water. It didn't geyser up like a fountain. It rose steadily, bubbling and surging, filling the deep shaft. Elias dropped a heavy wooden bucket down the hole on a rope. He pulled it up. Water spilled over the sides. Cold, clear, perfect water. Elias drank from the bucket. He poured the rest over his head, laughing out loud. A booming, joyous sound that echoed across the plains. He handed the bucket to Arthur, who drank deeply and passed it to Martha. Elias walked over to Abby. He was covered in mud. His chest heaved. He didn't say a word. He just took his muddy hands, framed her face, and kissed her forehead. A deep, lingering kiss of pure gratitude. "You saved the ranch," Elias whispered. "You saved us." Abby closed her eyes. The cool water from his hands felt like a baptism. The sun began to peek over the eastern ridge, dawn. The crisis was over. Elias and Arthur were already trenching a shallow spillway to lead the water to the thirsty cattle. Abby sat on the tailgate of the wagon. Her arms felt like lead. Her dress was ruined. Her hair was a tangled, muddy mess. She held a tin cup of cold water in her hands, just staring at it. Martha sat down next to her. She handed Abby a clean cloth to wipe her face. "I have lived out here a long time," Martha said softly. "I know how to find a shallow spring. I know how to track the morning dew, but I have never seen anyone red the deep earth the way you just did. It is a powerful gift you have, Abby." Abby wiped the dirt from her cheeks. She looked out at the water pooling in the new trench. She thought about Harrison. She thought about the elegant drawing rooms in Kansas, where she was told to sit quietly while the men discussed business and property. She turned to Martha. Her voice was quiet, but it held the strength of tempered steel. "For 20 years, my ex-husband told me a woman's intellect was only good for decorating a parlor," Abby said, looking Martha straight in the eyes. Martha listened, nodding slowly. Abby gripped her tin cup. She spoke the words clearly, making sure they hung in the morning air, undeniable and absolute. "But knowledge is power, Martha. A woman's right to education and to use her mind can bring a dead land back to life. No one has the right to cage a human mind, just because it belongs to a woman. From now on, I will live up to my true potential. I will never hide what I know again." Martha smiled. It was a proud, beautiful smile. She reached out and squeezed Abby's hand. "Your husband gave you a wasteland," Martha said, "and you just found the ocean underneath it." Abby looked up at the unfinished frame of the mansion in the distance. The sun was catching the raw wood, turning it golden. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was conquering. And the town of Dry Gulch, with all its poison and all its prejudice, was about to find out exactly who they were dealing with. The sky didn't darken. It bruised. It started around noon. The wind shifted, blowing straight down from the high peaks. It lost that dry, dusty bite. Instead, it smelled like wet iron, like winter. Abby wiped her forehead. The sweat on her skin was already turning cold. Elias was on the roof, nailing the last of the heavy sod squares into place over the kitchen. He stopped hammering. He stood up, balancing on the ridge beam, and looked north. The horizon was gone, swallowed by a wall of solid, chalky gray. "Drop the hammer!" Elias shouted. The wind swallowed half his words, but the urgency was clear. Storm's coming. Fast. Arthur and Martha were already hitching their team to the wagon. They had a 2-mile ride back to the main ranch house, and they needed to beat the snow to get the horses into the barn. Go! Elias yelled down to them, waving his hat. Don't stop for the tools. Get to cover! Arthur snapped the reins. The heavy wagon lurched forward, racing against the darkening sky. Abby grabbed a canvas tarp. She threw it over the open crates of nails and flour. The temperature was dropping by the second. It felt like walking into an ice house. Then the snow hit. It didn't fall. It drove. Hard, sideways sheets of ice and white powder. The wind hit the unfinished frame of the mansion with a sound like a freight train. Elias swung down from the rafters. He landed hard, his boots thudding against the wooden floorboards. He grabbed Abby by the arm. We can't stay in the house. Elias shouted over the roar of the wind. The windows are open. The wind will tear right through. It'll freeze us dead. Where do we go? Abby yelled back. She could barely see him through the blinding white. The root cellar. They had dug it out 2 weeks ago. A deep square pit lined with fieldstone, dug into the side of the slight hill behind the house. It had a heavy oak door, angled against the ground. It was meant for potatoes and carrots. Tonight, it was meant for them. Elias grabbed a kerosene lantern and a heavy wool blanket from the supply pile. He kept a tight grip on Abby's hand. They ran. It was only 50 yards, but it felt like 5 miles. The wind pushed against them like a solid wall. The snow bit into Abby's face like shattered glass. Her boots slipped in the rapidly accumulating drifts. Elias pulled the heavy wooden cellar door open. He practically shoved her inside, diving in right behind her. He pulled the door shut. He threw the heavy iron latch. Silence. It was sudden, complete. Above them, the storm raged and screamed, but down in the earth, it was just a dull, distant rumble. It was pitch black. Abby stood still, her chest heaving, her lungs burning from the cold air. She could hear Elias breathing heavily next to her. A match flared. The sudden yellow light pushed back the dark. Elias touched the match to the wick of the kerosene lantern. He adjusted the glass globe. The warm, golden light filled the small space. The cellar was 10 feet by 10 feet. Dirt floor, stone walls, smell of damp earth and cut pine. Elias hung the lantern on an iron hook driven into the ceiling joist. He laid the heavy wool blanket on the ground. Sit, Elias said. His voice was calm. Grounded. Get your boots off. We need to keep the blood moving. Abby sat. Her fingers were numb. She struggled with the laces of her boots. Elias knelt in front of her. He didn't ask. He just gently brushed her hands away, untied the frozen leather, and pulled her boots off. He took her cold feet between his large, calloused hands and rubbed them briskly. The friction brought a painful, tingling warmth back to her skin. Abby watched him in the lantern light. His hair was wet with melted snow. His face was weathered, lined with exhaustion and years of hard living. But his hands were incredibly gentle. We were going to be here a while, Elias said. He sat back, crossing his long legs on the dirt floor. A blow like this, it usually lasts till morning, sometimes longer. Are Arthur and Martha safe? Abby asked, her teeth chattering slightly. They had a head start. And Arthur knows these plains better than the wolves do. They made it. Elias unbuttoned his heavy canvas coat. He took it off and draped it around Abby's shoulders. It was huge on her. It smelled like wood smoke, leather, and him. Elias, you'll freeze, Abby protested, trying to shrug it off. He stopped her, putting a heavy hand on her shoulder. I'm used to the cold, Abby. Keep it on. She pulled the coat tighter. It was warm. The wind howled above the thick wooden door. It sounded angry, looking for a way in. They sat in the quiet, just the hiss of the lantern and the sound of their own breathing. It was a strange kind of intimacy. Two people, locked in a box beneath the earth, while the world tore itself apart above them. "You aren't used to the cold, Elias," Abby said softly. He looked up at her. The gray eyes were shadowed in the dim light. "You act like you are," Abby continued. "You work from sunup to sundown. You build, you dig, you fight the town, you fight the dirt, but you aren't made of stone. Nobody is." Elias looked away. He picked up a loose pebble from the dirt floor. He turned it over and over in his fingers. "I used to have a hearth," Elias said. His voice was lower now, stripped of the rough cowboy armor. "A real one, back in Ohio." Abby didn't push. She just listened. "Her name was Sarah," Elias said. "We were young, foolish, thought we could conquer the world with nothing but a wagon and a pair of mules. We came out here to build a life." He tossed the pebble away. It hit the stone wall with a hollow click. "7 years ago," Elias said, "winter came early, just like this. We were living in a sod hut, not much bigger than this cellar. She caught a fever." He stopped. He took a slow, ragged breath. "It was a bad one," he continued, sweating, shaking. "I told her to go to town, get the doctor, but the storm, it was a whiteout. I got 50 yards from the cabin and couldn't see my own hand. I had to turn back." He looked at his hands. The large, capable hands that had just built the frame of a mansion. The hands that could break a wild horse or dig a 50-foot well. "I sat by her bed for 3 days, Elias whispered. "I held her hand, and I watched her die. I couldn't do a damn thing to stop it." The silence in the cellar felt heavier now, weighed down by ghosts. "I buried her when the ground thawed," Elias said, "and after that I just stopped. I stopped building. I stopped trying. I bought the ranch, hired some hands, and I just existed. I told myself that if I never let anyone close, I'd never have to watch them die. I built a wall around my life, a thick one." He looked up at Abby. "Then you got off that train," Elias said, "with one bag and a piece of paper that said you were nothing, and I watched you pull that stake out of the ground. You were terrified. You were broken. But you refused to stay down." He reached out. He didn't touch her hand, but he rested his fingers on the edge of the blanket near her knee. "You made me want to pick up a hammer again, Abby." Abby felt a lump rise in her throat. She looked at this big, quiet man, a man who carried a mountain of grief, yet spent the last month trying to shelter her from her own storm. "I know about walls, Elias," Abby said. Her voice trembled, just a little. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping Elias's coat tighter around her. "Harrison Vance didn't hit me," Abby said. "He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He was a pillar of the community. Everyone respected him. But he looked at me every single day like I was a piece of furniture he had grown tired of." She stared at the yellow flame of the lantern. "When he found the younger woman, he didn't just ask me to leave. He wanted to erase me. He wanted to make sure I had nothing. Because a man like Harrison can't just win. He has to destroy the other side." Abby swallowed hard. The tears were close now. She had held them back for a month, through the blisters, through the exhaustion, through the insults in town. "But the money didn't matter," Abby said, her voice cracking. "The house in Kansas didn't matter. It was Lydia." The name hung in the air. "My daughter," Abby whispered. A tear spilled over her eyelashes. It cut a clean track through the dust on her cheek. "She is 19. I raised her. I sat by her bed when she had the measles. I taught her how to read. I brushed her hair every night." Abby's hands balled into fists in her lap. "Harrison sat her down in the parlor," Abby said, the memory playing out like a nightmare in the dark cellar. "He put a bank draft on the table, and he put my train ticket to Colorado next to it. He told her she could have the dresses, the trips to Europe, the high society marriage, or she could get on the train with a penniless mother. Abby covered her face with her hands. The sob tore out of her throat. It was an ugly, guttural sound of pure heartbreak. She didn't even cry, Elias. Abby wept into her hands. She just looked at the ticket. Then she looked at the bank draft. And she chose the paper. My own daughter. I looked at her, and I realized I had raised a stranger. I failed her. I failed as a mother. I am a ruin, she cried. She let it all go. The humiliation at the train station, the terror of the empty planes, the crushing, agonizing grief of a mother who had lost her child to greed. Elias didn't sit back. He didn't offer a polite handkerchief. He didn't look away to give her privacy. He shifted across the dirt floor. He wrapped his large arms around her. He pulled her against his chest. He held her tight, letting her sob into his canvas shirt. He rested his chin on the top of her head. He let her break. He was the foundation. He could hold the weight. They sat like that for a long time. The lantern flickered. The wind screamed outside. But Abby's crying slowly quieted. The storm inside her began to pass, leaving behind a raw, hollow exhaustion. She pulled back just slightly. She kept her hands resting on his chest. She looked up at him, her eyes red, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "I'm sorry," Abby whispered. "I shouldn't fall apart like this." Elias shook his head. His expression was fiercely serious. "Abby, listen to me," Elias said. His voice was deep, resonant, filling the small cellar. He spoke the words like gospel, like a truth she desperately needed to hear. "Trauma doesn't turn us into ruins," Elias said, looking directly into her eyes. "It doesn't make you worthless, and it doesn't make you broken. It just leaves scars." He reached up, gently wiping a tear from her cheek with his rough thumb. "The people who have suffered the most often have the greatest capacity to love," Elias told her, clearly, deliberately, "because they know what it costs. They know how fragile it is. You did not fail your daughter by loving her. Her choice is a reflection of Harrison's poison, not your mothering. You cannot bear the weight of another person's sins." Abby took a shaky breath, listening to every word. "Healing doesn't mean forgetting the pain," Elias continued, his voice softening, but the conviction remaining absolute. "It means giving yourself the right to be happy again. It means believing that you still deserve a warm fire, a solid roof, and a life that belongs only to you. You deserve to be happy, Abby, and you don't have to earn it." The words sank into her, deep into the cracked, dry places of her heart. For 20 been told, her value depended on her obedience, on her silence, on what she could provide for Harrison Vance. Elias was telling her something entirely different. He was telling her that her humanity was enough. Abby looked at his face in the lantern light. She saw the grief he carried for his Sarah. She saw the hard years on the prairie. And she saw the undeniable, steady truth in his eyes. "You deserve to be happy too, Elias," Abby whispered. Elias closed his eyes for a brief second. A silent acknowledgement. He pulled her back against his chest. They leaned back against the cold stone wall of the cellar. He pulled the wool blanket tightly around them both. "Get some sleep, Abby," Elias murmured, resting his cheek against her hair. "The storm will break by morning. They always do." Abby closed her eyes. The wind still howled. The temperature outside was deadly. They were sitting on a dirt floor in a hole in the ground. But as she listened to the steady, rhythmic beating of Elias Thorne's heart beneath his canvas shirt, Abby Preston realized something profound. For the first time in her life, she felt completely safe. The mansion above them was just wood and nails. It wasn't finished. But the real foundation, the one built on truth, shared pain, and absolute, unwavering respect was already poured. And nothing, not Silas Cobb, not Harrison Vance, and not the fiercest winter storm in Colorado, was ever going to break it. The storm broke just before dawn. The wind simply stopped. The sudden silence was louder than the howling had been. Elias pushed the heavy oak cellar door open. Snow tumbled down the stone steps. The world above was blindingly white. Clean. Frozen. They climbed out. The air was so cold it burned the lungs. But the sod roof of the mansion had held. The heavy beams stood black and stark against the white snow. Elias didn't linger. He checked the horses in the makeshift lean-to. They were shivering, but alive. He saddled his roan gelding. "I have to check the herd," Elias said. His breath plumed white in the air. "Arthur and Martha might need help digging out the northern fence line. Stay by the stove. Keep the fire hot." "Go?" Abby said. "I'll be fine." He rode out, cutting a deep trail through the fresh powder. Abby watched him go. She felt a strange, quiet warmth in her chest, a feeling she hadn't known in decades. Trust. She spent the morning clearing snow from the porch. She hauled firewood. She made coffee. Around noon, the quiet broke. A lone rider crested the eastern ridge. He was moving slow. The horse was struggling through the drifts. As he got closer, Abby recognized him. Not Silas Cobb. Cobb was too soft for this weather. It was the young clerk from the train depot. He rode up to the porch. He looked miserable, half frozen. "Mrs. Preston," the boy mumbled through a wool scarf. "Get down from there," Abby said. "Come to the fire. You refreezing." "Can't stay," the boy said. He reached into his heavy saddlebag. He pulled out a thick manila envelope. It was sealed with red wax. "Mr. Cobb paid me $2 to ride this out to you today. Said it was legal business. Said it couldn't wait." Abby looked at the envelope. Her stomach tightened. "Take it," the boy said, thrusting it forward. "My hands are numb." Abby took it. The paper felt heavy, cold. The boy turned his horse and began the slow, brutal trek back to town. Abby walked into the kitchen area of the house. The sod roof blocked the wind, but the windows were still empty frames. She sat by the iron stove. She broke the red wax seal. Inside was a stack of papers, copies of official county documents, and a letter. The letter was on Silas Copp's stationery. The handwriting was sharp, spiteful. "Mrs. Preston, you think you have found a savior. You have only found a smarter thief. Ask your cowboy how long he has known about the water. Look at the attached survey. The truth is in the dates. S. Cobb." Abby set the letter aside. She looked at the official documents. They were requests filed at the Regional Land Office. Requests for geological survey maps of the Dry Gulch Valley. Specifically, the fault line running beneath Harrison Vance S. 250 acres. Abby looked at the signature at the bottom of the request. Elias Thorne. Then she looked at the date. August 12, 1878. 2 full months before she had ever set foot on that train in Kansas. 2 months before Harrison had handed her the deed. 2 months before Elias had supposedly been surprised by her finding water in the dirt. He knew. He had always known. He knew the aquifer was there. He knew her land was worth a fortune. He watched her break her back with a pickaxe. He watched her do the math. He acted amazed. He acted proud. But he had known all along. Abby let the papers fall to her lap. She didn't cry. Crying was for when you were hurt. Right now, she wasn't hurt. She was cold, colder than the snow outside. Because Silas Cobb was right. The water was the prize, and Elias was just playing a longer, quieter game to get it. The afternoon crawled by. The sun hit the western peaks. Abby heard the crunch of hooves. Elias rode into the yard. He looked exhausted. His coat was covered in ice, But when he saw her standing on the porch, he smiled, a genuine, tired smile. He swung down from the saddle. He tied the horse. He walked up the steps.
Herd is safe,
Elias said, brushing snow from his hat. Lost a few calves, but Arthur managed to break the ice on the creek. The water you found, it's flowing fine. He stopped. He finally really looked at her. Abby was standing perfectly still. The thick manila envelope was in her hand. Elias saw the broken red wax. He saw the corner of the county survey sticking out. The smile fell from his face. The color drained from his cheeks. He didn't ask what it was. He didn't feign ignorance. He just stood there, the wind whipping the hem of his heavy coat. August, Abby said. Her voice was flat, empty. Elias closed his eyes for a second. He swallowed hard. Abby. August the 12th, she continued, stepping forward. You pulled the geological surveys for this exact plot of land. You knew about the fault line. You knew the aquifer was there. I suspected, Elias said softly. I wasn't certain until you read the dirt. But yes, I suspected. And you didn't tell me, Abby. Listen to me, no. Abby cut him off. Her voice cracked like a whip in the freezing air. You listened to me. Silas Cobb told me you were using me. I called him a liar. I defended you. I sat in a root cellar with you and poured out my soul, because I thought you were the one honest man left in the world. She threw the papers at his chest. They scattered into the snow. Why? Abby demanded. The anger was rising now, hot and fierce. Were you going to wait until the house was built? Were you going to offer me a few dollars for the deed, once I was tired enough to take it? No. Elias stepped forward, his eyes wide. God, no, Abby. I never wanted to steal your land. I never wanted to trick you. Then why hide it? She yelled. Elias stopped. His broad shoulders slumped. The truth was heavy, and he had carried it too long. Because of Harrison, Elias said, his voice thick with shame. When you got off that train, you were terrified of men who used their power to control you. If I told you on day one that your land was a gold mine, you would have thought I was just another vulture. You wouldn't have let me help you. Build the house, you would have pushed me away. He looked down at the snow. I wanted to protect you, Elias whispered. I wanted to give you time to trust me. I thought I was doing the right thing. Abby stared at him. The betrayal in her chest didn't soften. It crystallized. She walked down the porch steps. She stood right in front of him. She didn't look up at him like a victim. She looked at him like a judge. Equality demands absolute truth, Elias, Abby said. She pronounced every single word with deliberate, piercing clarity. When you hid the truth because you thought you were protecting me, you stripped away my right to make an informed choice. You treated me like a child who couldn't handle the facts of her own life. Elias flinched. The words hit him harder than a physical blow. Respecting someone means handing them the whole truth, no matter how ugly it is, Abby continued, her voice echoing across the silent, snow-covered yard. You don't get to decide what I can handle. You don't get to manage my reality. That is not protection. That is control. Elias looked at her. His gray eyes were filled with a profound, crushing regret. He knew she was right. He had built the walls of a mansion, but he had poured the foundation on a lie of omission. I was wrong, Elias said. His voice broke. Abby, I am so sorry. Sorry doesn't fix the foundation, Abby said. She turned her back to him. She walked up the steps. She stopped at the door. Take your horse, Abby said, looking out at the horizon. Go back to your ranch. Do not come back to my property. Elias stood in the snow. He looked at the half-finished house. He looked at the woman he loved, standing on the porch, her spine made of steel. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. A real man knows when he has lost the right to speak. He gathered the reins of his horse. He swung into the saddle. He rode away, leaving a trail of deep broken tracks in the pristine snow. Abby watched until he was a dark speck against the white plains. Then she went inside. She locked the door. And for the first time since she arrived in Colorado, she was truly, utterly alone. The quiet was a physical weight. For 3 days, the snow melted. The plains turned into a sea of red mud. Abby stayed in the house. She chopped her own wood. She hauled her own water from the new well. She didn't look toward Elias S. Ranch. Silas Cobb thought he had won. He thought he had broken the alliance. He thought the city lady would finally pack her bags and run back east, leaving the water rights ripe for the picking. Cobb didn't know Abigail Waverly Preston. On the 4th morning, the mud had dried enough to travel. Abby didn't hitch the wagon. She saddled the sturdy brown mare Elias had left behind. She packed her leather valise, not with clothes, with paper, with charcoal, with the ledger books she had kept for the last month. She didn't ride toward Dry Gulch. She rode north, toward Oak Haven, the county seat. It was a grueling 6-hour ride. Her thighs ached. Her back burned, but she pushed the horse steadily. Oak Haven was a real town. Brick buildings, a paved main street, a stone courthouse with tall arched windows. Abby tied her horse to the iron rail outside the courthouse. She beat the dust from her skirt. She gripped her leather bag. She walked up the stone steps. She found the county clerk's office. "I need to see the freight manifests for the Denver-Rio Grande rail line, covering the Dry Gulch district for the last 6 months, Abby told the clerk. A balding man with wire-rimmed glasses. He blinked. "Ma'am, those are public records, but they read a mess. Hundreds of pages." "I have time," Abby said. They pointed her to a back room, a room filled with dusty stacks of paper. Abby sat down. She opened her bag. She took out her charcoal. She wasn't building a house today. She was dismantling a man. She started reading. Her eyes tracked the numbers, the dates, the weights. Her mind fell into the familiar, comforting rhythm of mathematics. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not omit the truth to protect your feelings. Within 2 hours, she found the pattern. Silas Cobb wasn't just delaying her lumber. He was running a massive, illegal squeeze-out. He was using a dummy corporation, a mining supply company, to buy up all the incoming freight space on the trains. He choked off the supply of winter goods to the small homesteaders. When the homesteaders went broke or froze out, Cobb's company bought their foreclosed land for pennies on the dollar. And the money funding the dummy corporation? It was wired from a bank in Kansas. Harrison Vance S. Bank. It was federal wire fraud. It was extortion. And it was all right there in the math. Abby didn't stop. She copied the ledger entries. She cross-referenced the dates of the foreclosures. She built an ironclad paper trail. By 4 o'clock, her fingers were black with charcoal. Her neck was stiff. But she had it. She walked out of the records room. She asked for the district magistrate. Judge Henry Tolliver was a stern man. He had a thick white beard and a no-nonsense demeanor. He looked surprised when a woman in a mud-stained dress walked into his chambers. "Can I help you, madam?" the judge asked. Abby placed her stack of papers on his heavy oak desk. "Judge Tolliver?" Abby said. "My name is Abigail Preston. I am a property owner in Dry Gulch, and I am here to report a systemic criminal conspiracy involving federal land grants, interstate wire fraud, and the extortion of Colorado citizens." The judge raised an eyebrow. He looked at the papers. "Those are heavy accusations, Mrs. Preston." "The math is heavier," Abby replied. "Look at page 3. The judge put on his spectacles. He looked. He turned the page. He kept reading. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock. 10 minutes later, the judge looked up. His eyes were wide. The sternness was replaced with sharp, focused anger. Not at her, at the numbers. "This man Cobb," the judge said slowly. "He is starving out half the county." "Yes, Your Honor," Abby said. "He is acting as an agent for Harrison Vance. They are using financial starvation to bypass federal homestead laws." The judge stood up. "Mrs. Preston, where did you learn to audit a ledger like this?" "I was married to a thief for 20 years," Abby said simply. "You learn how they hide the silver." Judge Tolliver nodded. He pulled out a fresh sheet of official parchment. He dipped his pen in the inkwell. "I am issuing an immediate federal injunction against Silas Cobb," the judge declared. "I am freezing his accounts. I will dispatch 2 U.S. Marshals to Dry Gulch tomorrow morning to seize his office and his records. Your lumber will be released immediately." The judge handed her a stamped, sealed copy of the injunction. "You have done a great service to this territory today, Mrs. Preston," Judge Tolliver said. Abby took the paper. "I just want my roof, Your Honor." She rode back to Dry Gulch the next day. The air felt different, lighter. The poison had been drawn out of the wound. When she crested the ridge and saw her land, she stopped. The mansion stood tall against the blue sky. It was exactly as she had left it. But parked in the front yard was a wagon, loaded with fresh, sweet-smelling cedar shingles. Her lumber. The marshals had worked fast. Sitting on the tailgate of the wagon was Elias Thorne. He stood up when he saw her ride in. He didn't rush forward. He took off his hat. He held it in his hands. Abby rode up. She dismounted. She tied the mare to the post. She walked over to the wagon. Elias looked at her. He looked older than he had 4 days ago. The quiet stoicism was gone. What was left was complete, vulnerable honesty. He reached into the wagon bed. He pulled out a heavy stack of leather-bound books. His ranch ledgers. His survey maps. His bank books. Everything. He set them on the tailgate, right in front of her. "My whole life is in these books, Abby," Elias said. His voice was low, carrying the rhythmic cadence of a man speaking his deepest truth. "Every dollar, every acre, every mistake, every secret." Abby looked at the books. Then she looked at his gray eyes. "I don't want to protect you anymore," Elias said. He didn't look away. "I don't want to manage you. I don't want to stand in front of you." He took a slow breath. A real man is never threatened by a woman, as intelligence or independence, Elias said, his words ringing clear and steady in the crisp air. "He celebrates it. I was wrong not to treat you as a fully equal partner from day one. I let my fear make decisions for you. I will never do that again." He placed his large, calloused hand flat on top of the ledgers. "From here on out," Elias promised, stating it as a permanent law of his life, "there will be no blind protection. There will only be absolute truth. I am asking to stand shoulder to shoulder with you, in absolute respect, as equals. Or not at all." Abby listened. She heard the tremor of genuine remorse. She saw the total surrender of his ego. He wasn't the cowboy riding in to save the helpless woman anymore. He was a man asking a woman to build a life with him. Abby looked at the cedar shingles in the wagon. She looked at the massive, unfinished house behind them. She had gone to the county seat. She had broken Cobb. She had secured her land. She had proven to herself, once and for all, that she did not need a man to survive, which meant, if she chose him now, it wasn't out of desperation. It was a choice, a free, equal choice. Abby stepped forward. She placed her hand over his, resting on the ledgers. "Shoulder to shoulder," Abby said. Her voice was soft, but the rhythm was strong. "Equal partners." Elias closed his eyes. A long, shuddering breath escaped his chest. When he opened his eyes, the heavy grief was gone. He didn't grab her. He didn't sweep her into his arms. He simply turned his hand over and intertwined his fingers with hers. A firm, unshakable grip. "We have a lot of shingles to nail, partner," Elias said, a small, genuine smile finally touching the corners of his eyes. Abby smiled back. "Then we better get the hammers." Winter didn't leave without a fight. It dragged its boots across the plains. It threw ice. It howled through the nights. But it couldn't stop the hammers. Abby and Elias worked side by side, equal partners. No secrets. No shadows. The cedar shingles went up fast. The wood smelled sharp, clean, like a new beginning. When the last shingle was nailed down, they stood on the roof together. They looked out over the snow-covered valley. The house was sealed tight. The iron stove in the kitchen burned hot. They had beaten Silas Cobb. They had beaten the winter. Spring finally broke in late April. The thaw turned the dirt to thick red mud, and then, miraculously, the mud turned green. The prairie grass shot up. Wildflowers bloomed in sudden, violent bursts of purple and yellow. The well Abby had found was pumping cold, clear water. The spillway fed Elias' herd. The overflow fed a massive garden Abby and Martha had plotted out behind the mansion. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sun was warm. Elias was down by the creek, helping the sheriff survey the new boundary lines. Silas Cobb was in federal custody, awaiting trial in Denver. Harrison Vance was under investigation for wire fraud. Abby sat on the wide front porch. She was sanding the rail of a wooden rocking chair Elias had built. Arthur walked up the steps. He carried a fresh pot of coffee from the kitchen. He poured 2 cups and handed one to Abby. "Thank you, Arthur," Abby said, setting her sandpaper down. Arthur leaned against the heavy porch pillar. He looked out at the green valley. He watched Elias' distant figure on a horse. "He rides different now," Arthur said. His deep voice rumbled softly. Abby took a sip of the hot coffee. "Different how?" "Lighter," Arthur said. He turned and looked at Abby. His dark eyes were serious, unblinking. "Before you came, he sat heavy in the saddle, like a man riding to a hanging." Abby frowned. "He missed his wife. He was carrying grief. I know how heavy that is." Arthur shook his head. "It was more than grief, Abby. Grief fades into an ache. This was rot. He was giving up." Abby put her cup down. The warm breeze suddenly felt still. "Elias doesn't give up," Abby said. "Every man gives up if he loses his reason for drawing breath," Arthur said quietly. "You didn't see him last summer." He stopped fixing the fences. He stopped rotating the herd. He told me to start looking for other work. He was going to sell the ranch to the bank. He was going to ride up into the high country and just fade away. Abby stared at Arthur. Her heart skipped a slow, heavy beat. "The lumber," Arthur said, pointing a calloused finger at the cedar roof above them. "He bought that lumber last August, when he first looked at the survey maps. Long before Harrison Vance threw you away." "I know," Abby said. "He told me. He bought it when he realized my land had water." "No," Arthur corrected her gently. "He didn't buy it to build a house for a stranger. He bought it to build a spite wall, a big, ugly barn right on the property line. He was going to drain the aquifer, bleed the land dry, sell it all, and disappear. He was angry. At God. At the dirt. At himself." Abby stood up. She touched the smooth, sanded wood of the porch railing. "Then the train came," Arthur said. He smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "And you stepped off it, with your one bag, and your broken heart. He watched you pull that stake out of the dirt." Arthur finished his coffee. He set the tin cup on the railing. "He didn't build this mansion to get back at your husband, Abby," Arthur said. He built it to save his own life. You gave him a reason to pick up a hammer instead of a bottle. You saved him long before you found the water. Arthur tipped his hat. He walked down the stairs, heading back to the barn. Abby stood on the porch for a long time. She looked at the house, the grand, sweeping lines of it, the sturdy walls. She had thought this house was a monument to her survival. She was wrong. It was a monument to mutual salvation. That evening, the air cooled. The stars came out, thick and bright. Elias sat by the iron stove in the kitchen. He was rubbing oil into a leather bridle. His hands moved with that steady, rhythmic grace. Abby sat across from him. She watched him work. Arthur told me about last summer, Abby said. Elias' hands stopped moving. He didn't look up right away. He kept his eyes on the worn leather. Arthur talks too much, Elias muttered, but there was no anger in it. He told me you were going to sell, Abby said. He told me you were going to walk away from everything. From the ranch. From life. Elias set the bridle down. He wiped his hands on a rag. He looked up at her. The gray eyes were entirely open. No walls. No pride. I was hollowed out, Abby, Elias said softly. A man can only walk around empty for so long before the wind blows him over. I didn't care about the cattle. I didn't care about the land. I was just waiting for the clock to run out. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Then I saw you, Elias said. Harrison broke you. He took your money. He took your daughter. He put you in the middle of a desert. And instead of dying, you asked for a pickaxe. Elias shook his head, a look of profound wonder on his face. Watching you fight back, Elias whispered. It woke me up. It reminded me what a human spirit looks like when it refuses to be crushed. Abby stood up. She walked over to him. She knelt down on the pine floorboards, right in front of his chair. She took his large, calloused hands in hers. You told me once that I deserved a mansion, Abby said. Her voice was steady, clear. She wanted these words to settle deep into his bones. You did, Elias said. So do you, Abby replied. She squeezed his hands. Elias, look at me. He met her eyes. The compassion between two human beings is the greatest miracle of all, Abby said, speaking the truth with absolute conviction. When you are hurt, the world tells you to harden your heart, to build walls, to look out only for yourself. But that is a lie. True healing doesn't happen in isolation. Elias listened. He held his breath. You built me a house so I would have a safe place to belong, Abby continued, her voice ringing with the weight of her earned wisdom. But your kindness, your decency, and your willingness to treat me as an equal, that is what rebuilt the souls in both of us. We didn't just build a house, Elias. We built a life worth living. A single tear tracked down Elias' weathered cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't hide it. He leaned down. He rested his forehead against hers. I love you. Abigail Preston, Elias said. The words were a quiet vow, a permanent truth. I love your mind. I love your strength. I love your heart. Abby closed her eyes. She felt the warmth of his hands, the steady beat of his pulse. I love you, Elias Thorne, Abby whispered back, and I'm never leaving. Outside, the Colorado wind blew across the green plains. But inside the mansion, the air was warm, and the foundation was unbreakable. Spring of 1880, 2 years since the train dropped a broken woman at a dusty depot. The land was unrecognizable. Harrison Van Ness's barren plot of dirt was the jewel of the valley. The massive underground aquifer, pumped by a towering wooden windmill, fed acres of lush alfalfa and sweet corn. And in the center of it all stood the mansion. It was magnificent. 2 stories of solid pine and fieldstone. A wraparound porch wide enough to host a barn dance. high windows that caught the morning light and threw it across polished hardwood floors. It wasn't a house built to show off. It was a house built to endure. It was Saturday. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Abby stood in front of a mirror in the large downstairs bedroom. She wore a dress of deep blue silk. It wasn't fussy. It didn't have corsets designed to restrict her breathing. It was elegant, simple, and comfortable. Martha stood behind her, pinning a small white prairie rose into Abby's dark hair. "You look beautiful," Martha said softly, "like a queen in her own castle." Abby smiled at the reflection. She didn't look like the terrified woman from Kansas anymore. There were lines around her eyes now from the sun. Her hands weren't soft. They were strong, capable. "I feel like myself," Abby said. "For the first time in my life." There was a knock on the door frame. Sheriff Jed Carter stood there, wearing a clean suit and his polished silver star. "Time, Abby," the sheriff said, smiling warmly. Abby took a breath. She smoothed her skirt. She walked out of the room. They didn't go to a church in town. They didn't need to. The church was right here, on the wood they had cut, on the land they had bled for. Abby walked out onto the wide front porch. Arthur was there, wearing a dark vest, holding a worn Bible. A small group of loyal ranch hands stood in the yard, hats in hand. And at the end of the porch stood Elias. He wore a dark suit, a crisp white shirt. He had shaved. When he looked at Abby, his eyes lit up like a brush fire. He held out his hand. Abby walked to him. She took his hand. It was a grip of absolute equality. Arthur opened the Bible. He didn't read traditional vows. They had written their own. Elias spoke first. His voice boomed across the quiet yard. "I take you, Abigail, not as property, and not as a subordinate," Elias swore, his eyes never leaving hers. "I take you as my true equal. I promise to respect your mind. I promise to listen to your voice. I promise to build with you, fight beside you, and love you until the dirt takes me back." Abby felt her heart swell. She squeezed his hands. "I take you, Elias, not as a savior, and not as a shield," Abby answered, her voice clear and carrying over the breeze. "I take you as my true equal. I promise to share my strength. I promise to speak the truth, even when it is hard. I promise to stand shoulder to shoulder with you, in the storms and in the sun, for all the days of my life." Arthur smiled. "By the power of God and the hard earth of this territory, I pronounce you husband and wife." Elias pulled her in. He kissed her, not a polite peck, a deep, passionate, world-shifting kiss. The ranch hands cheered. Jed Carter tossed his hat in the air. It was perfect. But out west, life rarely lets you rest on perfect for long. The sound of rattling wheels cut through the cheering. A hired carriage was rolling up the long dirt driveway. It was covered in road dust. The driver pulled the exhausted horses to a halt at the edge of the yard. The heavy wooden door of the carriage creaked open. A young woman stepped out. She wore a dress that used to be expensive, but was now wrinkled and stained. She looked thin, pale. Her eyes were red-rimmed and wide with fear. It was Lydia. Abby's breath hitched. She let go of Elias's hand. She took a step toward the edge of the porch. Lydia looked up. She saw the massive mansion. She saw the green fields. And then she saw her mother. Not broken, not destitute, radiating strength, and surrounded by people who loved her. Lydia burst into tears. She fell to her knees in the dirt of the front yard. "Mama," Lydia sobbed. The sound was ragged, desperate. Abby didn't hesitate. She didn't hold on to her pride. She didn't remember the betrayal at the train station. She was a mother. Abby ran down the steps. She fell to her knees in the dirt, her blue silk dress pooling around her. She grabbed her daughter. She pulled Lydia against her chest, wrapping her arms tightly around the shaking girl. "I've got you," Abby whispered fiercely into Lydia's hair. "I've got you, my sweet girl. You're safe." Lydia clung to Abby's neck. "He threw me out, Mama. Father threw me out. The new wife didn't want me around. He told me I was a burden. He took the bank drafts back. He said I was worthless." Lydia pulled back, looking at Abby with terrified, ashamed eyes. "I was so foolish," Lydia wept. "I chose the money. I let him buy me, and then he threw me away just like he threw you away. Can you ever forgive me? I have nowhere else to go." The yard was dead silent. Elias stood on the porch, his jaw tight. Jed Carter put a hand on his gun belt, as if he wanted to shoot Harrison Vance across 2 state lines. Abby looked at her daughter. She smoothed the tangled hair back from Lydia's face. "Lydia, listen to me," Abby said. Her voice was an anchor in the storm. She spoke loudly enough for her daughter and for everyone in the yard to hear. "You do not need to earn my forgiveness," Abby stated, her voice thick with unconditional love, "because a mother's love is not a transaction. Harrison Vance taught you that love was something you buy. He taught you that people are disposable when they are no longer useful. That is a poison, Lydia. And it stops right here." Abby pulled Lydia to her feet. She held her daughter's face in her hands. "You are not worthless," Abby said, instilling every ounce of her own hard-won education into the girl. "A woman's worth is not determined by a man's bank account, and it is not determined by whether a man wants to keep her. Your value is in your mind, in your heart, in your humanity. You belong to yourself." "Lydia," I cried her, but this time the tears weren't made of fear. They were tears of immense relief, the breaking of a chain. "You are home, Lydia," Abby said, wiping her daughter's tears. "You have a room upstairs. You have a family, and no man will ever make you feel small again." Elias walked down the porch steps. He didn't look angry. He looked at Lydia with profound kindness. He took off his suit jacket and draped it over Lydia's shivering shoulders. "Welcome home, Lydia," Elias said gently. "Let's get you inside. Martha has food on the stove." Lydia looked at Elias, the big, formidable cowboy. She saw the gentleness in his gray eyes. She nodded, leaning heavily against her mother. Together, the three of them walked up the steps. They walked across the wide porch. They walked through the heavy oak doors into the warmth of the mansion. That night, the house was quiet. Lydia was asleep in a soft bed upstairs. The guests had gone home. Abby and Elias stood on the second-floor balcony attached to their bedroom. The moon was high, casting a silver light over the miles of green crops swaying in the gentle wind. Elias stood behind Abby. He wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. Abby leaned back against his solid chest. She covered his hands with hers. They looked out at the empire they had built from the dust. "Harrison banished me to the most barren land he could find," Abby murmured, breaking the quiet. "He put me on a train, hoping I would break, hoping I would disappear." Elias pulled her just a fraction tighter. He looked out over the thriving land, over the water pumping from the deep earth, over the life they had fought for. He kissed the side of her head. His voice was deep, steady, and filled with absolute certainty. "He forgot one thing," Elias said, his words echoing softly into the Colorado night. "No land is truly barren if it is tended with equal respect and love." Abby smiled, looking up at the stars. "And no woman is ever a ruin," Elias whispered, "especially when she deserves a mansion to call home." This story teaches us that justice begins when ordinary people refuse to stay silent, and that equality, truth, and compassion can turn barren ground into a home. On this channel, you find powerful stories of Western cowboys, frontier love, motherhood, human mercy, kindness, and the strength of wounded souls. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more stories that warm the heart and stir the spirit.
As the Colorado wind finally settled across the endless plains, Abby Preston stood on the balcony of the mansion that the world once said could never exist. A woman abandoned with one bag and a broken heart had turned barren land into life, pain into strength, and loneliness into a family built on truth and respect. And maybe that is the true soul of the West. Not the guns, not the outlaws, but the people who keep standing after life tries to bury them in the dust. This story reminds us that human dignity can never be taken away by betrayal, poverty, or heartbreak. Harrison Vance believed money gave him power over people. He believed a woman without wealth, status, or a husband had no future. But Abby proved something far greater, that real strength is born from courage, self-respect, and the refusal to surrender your humanity, even when the world treats you as disposable. Elias Thorne also teaches us an important truth. A real man does not fear a strong woman. He does not silence her mind or control her choices. He stands beside her as an equal. Their love was not built on rescue or ownership. It was built on honesty, compassion, partnership, and mutual respect. And in a world filled with selfishness and pride, that kind of love is rarer than gold. The story also carries a powerful lesson about healing. Trauma leaves scars, but scars do not make a person weak. Sometimes the people who have suffered the deepest pain become the ones most capable of kindness, empathy, and unconditional love. Abby's forgiveness toward Lydia shows us that love is not a transaction. A mother's heart does not keep score. Even after betrayal, compassion still found a way home. And perhaps the greatest message of all is this: no land is truly barren when it is cared for with love, and no human soul is truly ruined when it is given dignity, truth, and hope. Every person deserves the chance to rebuild. Every person deserves respect. And sometimes, the very place where life tried to destroy us becomes the place where we finally discover who we were meant to be. Here on this channel, we share powerful Western cowboy stories filled with frontier love, sacrifice, motherhood, compassion, human kindness, and the unbreakable spirit of people who fight through hardship to build a better life. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe so you never miss another unforgettable journey across the wild frontier. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event.